Welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Brad King. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Next Dimension. We're very fortunate today to have our Todyl Andrew Scott here to present some of the key strategies to help you defend against the crazily increasing cyber attacks that we are witnessing on a regular basis out there. I'm not sure if all of you have been attending this call who've seen this, but we for sure as an MSP have seen a dramatic increase recently of what's going on out there in the cyberspace. So welcome everybody. Hopefully you find this very informative. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew for his presentation, and we should have a few minutes at the end for any questions. Thanks for joining. Andrew, over to you.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it, Brad. Great to speak with you and everyone today. So, we're going to talk about managing business risk in the ever-evolving threat landscape. Really, all the cyber attacks and all the stuff we see out there in the news, really, what does this mean? What are organizations really up against? As Brad mentioned, really, what are some security solutions and strategies really how do we get ahead of this? There is a path forward, but, it can be kind of hard to sometimes identify that with, all the noise and, a lot of the threats out there that concern businesses. So before I get going, I'll get into the agenda and, quick introduction here in a moment, but I want folks to really think about, two questions. That I want you to keep in the back of your mind as I work through this. One, based upon whatever your organization is or what you do, how much is that business worth to you, right? What is the value of your organization, right? It could be monetary, reputation, relationship, and then really, what is the most amount of pain, right? Whether it's downtime, financial costs, legal, that you're really willing to sustain before that becomes to get too much, because this is really what adversaries and threat actors are going to kind of press on. They're going to try to really, kind of pressure organizations. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we work through this. So, the agenda for today, I'm going to be reviewing the evolving threat landscape, some of, the new emerging trends and kind of patterns we're seeing, both Todyl as well as in the overall security landscape, that we see kind of going on, multiple different verticals. We're going to look at a couple different examples of these. So really that shift towards identity as the new perimeter, really identity and kind of users and credentials being kind of that initial target and way into organizations, and the evolution of ransomware, right? Towards data theft extortion. So how does business email compromise and data theft extortion really, what does this mean for organizations, for you on the phone? And then really what are those security solutions and strategies? And then we'll open it up to Q&A, right? A little bit about myself. I've been, kind of in the cyber, government, or intelligence sectors for, kind of going on, 12, 13 years now. I really spent a majority of my time, building security programs, whether as a federal MSSP leader, being more of an executive security advisor and consultant on building programs out, also, an enterprise solutions architect. So really my focus is developing those proactive, kind of strategies. How do we help organizations of all sizes and verticals really imagine forward on protecting your business as well? All right. So diving into the evolving threat landscape, I want to kind of paint a picture looking outside in of why would an adversary target a small, medium-sized business or a mid-market organization, really? Why are you a target? Many organizations we talk to could say, I'm too small, or no one's really going to, target me. And that can be comforting, but unfortunately, it's really not that true. So when you look at kind of the organizations and kind of what you do, as I was saying, bear in mind kind of the value of your org, you likely hold some sensitive data, right? And that's a value to an adversary of either stealing that, reselling that data, but also, kind of putting pressure on you that if you're not able to access that because of what you need to do day to day. And that's where we see ransomware, data theft extortion being a lot of those mechanisms to prevent access to that sensitive data or steal it, where you'll start feeling that pressure, breach notifications, legal fines, even having to pay ransoms, but also that evolution away from ransomware. And I'll get to that in a little bit, but adversaries are starting to skip the ransomware malware delivery stage and just move straight to stealing data. Unfortunately, SMBs and mid-markets, you have budgets that you've got to do a lot with. And sometimes that can mean you're making tough decisions on, do I hire more people? Do I open a new office? Do we release a new product line? Or am I investing in security or IT? And so what this can mean is that organizations have a less mature security posture we just generally see in SMB versus big enterprise organizations, the Banks of Americas, the big Fortune 500 250s, and also you have a lot of relationships, whether that's in supply chain, manufacturing, transportation, logistics, healthcare, multiple different avenues. But also, it's not me, it's you, that kind of concept. But the relationships you have, right? Your customers, who you do business with, who your supply partners are, right? Who downstream from you, you're providing services to. All of that is also considered by an adversary of how can I target an organization to gain access to exploit many others, right? So you might be a jumping point to many others. So it's being aware of your role with the rest of, kind of your business ecosystem. And so we really see the most likely threats, kind of obviously cybercrime, ransomware, the extortion groups, a lot of that, those cyber criminals that are working on the dark web, providing resources or, to others, or simply carrying out those attacks as really that number one threat to SMB and mid-market. But I think it's also really critical to evaluate your supply chain, right? What technologies, providers, et cetera, how are you doing business with technology, whether it's a service provider, right, the tools you're choosing to use, and what sort of vulnerabilities or exposure may that be opening up to, or where you're so heavily entrenched on one or others that maybe that's opening up a lot of risk if that itself is compromised, right? We saw that with SolarWinds several years back and the, kind of ramifications there. And so supply chain and targeting, technology providers continues to be a technique of adversaries. Also insider threats, right? And this can be, intentional, but also oftentimes accidental, right? Oops, I emailed out our client list or PII, or I accidentally exposed some systems that I shouldn't have because, we've got, kind of a bunch of different tasks for IT administrators. So really think about, kind of the role of your own people, right? And how they have access to information, how are you tracking that? How are you monitoring who's got access to what? Those insider threats can also be, kind of damning for organizations. But also, finally, we see ideologically aligned adversaries, really these hacktivists, where they may disagree with the, kind of focus or function or mission of an organization, where their key stakeholders or executives are more vocal on certain topics. And that can also paint a picture, right, target on an organization's back. And we started to see more of that during the, kind of initial onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, but where, organizations that were choosing one side or another started to get targeted by the opposite side. And obviously, we're not going to get any politics or anything like that, but I think it's important to be aware of the persona and kind of perspective that you exhibit as an organization to the internet and to the world and kind of what that can mean. So overall, really, it's about protecting the data and the functions that you all have, but also what the value of that is, from an adversary's perspective and why they would target you. Even if you are smaller, they're really driven by financial benefit, motivations, et cetera. And so no target is really too small. So what we see in kind of the evolving threats, right, kind of looking at big picture trends, those damages are continuing to rise, right? Adversaries are just moving hard and fast. And so $10.5 trillion in projected damages by adversaries this year. But what's really concerning, right, is we've seen this trend over the last several years, but where the increase in identity-focused attacks since 2023, Todyl has observed in kind of the broader industry as well, a 558% increase in identity-focused attacks versus, let's say, malware. So the bottom line here is threat actors and bad actors, they're logging in, they're not hacking in. So what is your perspective and awareness of how your users are working? Are they actually them? What do they have access to? How am I kind of looking that deeply? That's really now where organizations need to be shifting perspective to based upon these shifts in the threat landscape. So, also then kind of the ramifications, 47% of small businesses suffered an attack last year. And we really see where those organizations lose about, a third of clients, right, because of that data breach. And so this really ties the importance of that data, who you're serving, what verticals you're in, and the value that your customers or your peers are really placing on that business relationship and the two-way trust of, hey, I don't want to have to go through again red exposure or more credit monitoring and stuff like that. And finally, like I said, small businesses are 3 times more likely to be targeted. And that's unfortunately because many of them are soft targets, right? They've got less capabilities. And so they are going to be an easier target, even if they are smaller. Those criminals are not going to, differentiate on that. And so if we shift to looking a little bit more at the industry verticals, right, that Todyl's been observing, so we protect, 15,000 plus end user organizations and growing, we really see where there's about 5 top industries being targeted, obviously healthcare, right, being out there in the news, but also really being targeted heavily. Then partnered with, kind of next is professional, scientific, and technical services. So this would include, law firms, service centers, a lot of different, kind of functions, finance and insurance, technology, and real estate, manufacturing, logistics, all those are up there and kind of weave in with those top industries. We're also seeing least targeted, right, kind of accommodations, food services, arts, religious organizations, orgs that maybe have a little bit less profile or are more localized, less of maybe an internet presence, at least being, also there's a larger volume, right, of some of these other organizations I line out here on the left. But really about understanding your role, where you fall in with these different industries, how you're serving and supporting those, let's say, as a possible target, or maybe you're in those industries specifically. And so if we look at the attack vectors by industry, so we're just looking at, hey, what industries in general are being targeted. Now, if we look at what are the actual, kind of attacks occurring by vertical, we see that, there's some that are heavily being targeted that we've been observing with like ransomware and extortion-based attacks. So real estate, financial services, technology, law, and legal. Really, what's that sensitive data or those functions that if I lock that up or if I steal that, it's going to be really damning to that organization or painful, and they may not be able to recover. So if we look at EDR, that being endpoint detection response, really more very stealthy kind of behaviors on endpoints and so forth that we're monitoring for, it's a similar vein, but really shifting towards more of those professional, technical services, scientific, really a lot of those services, right, or kind of support or legal or professional services organizations, also finance and healthcare. And then really where we see also identity, right, being used heavily again, it's the same ones. But I think it's the right-hand side that's also really critical to understand and to take a look at is, yes, I've lined out 3, kind of verticals, but this is the shift towards those identity-based attacks, business email compromise, really gaining access to environments in more stealthy manners, and where, data is incredibly important. So that's why I was going at, what do you hold? That's super critical. And we've been fortunate here at the scheduling of our webinar here today that the Verizon data breach report, was just released a couple of weeks ago. And so there's some interesting perspectives here. So, 37%, I mentioned about the volume and speed of ransomware and extortion-based attacks, 37% increase in ransomware attacks year over year. It's coming hard and fast and growing, where now almost half of all breaches involve ransomware of some kind. All right, so that's important to be aware of. Ransomware or some extortion-related, threat is about almost half of all breaches, and then $115,000 is that median cost of a ransom payment. So we've seen ones that are multi-millions of dollars, but this is, a significant amount of money for an SMB or a mid-market organization that, this is a full-time employee. This may be salary overhead. Could be the choice of, kind of inventory and paying for that. And so that's what I was saying, really, what is that pressure point? What is that pain at a certain level? Is $115,000, the median cost of ransom payment, too much to stomach? Only you can answer that. But this is where we're seeing that trend, where also 88% of, is the rate that SMBs experience ransomware extortion-related breaches versus large orgs. And so Verizon's dividing that at like about 1,000 employees or more is a large org, less is SMB. So that's overwhelmingly SMBs being targeted in ransomware extortion related. I mentioned, the I'm too small to be targeted. This is, kind of counter to that. And I mentioned just the credential use of, almost a quarter of all breaches are using credential theft for initial access. Like I said, they're logging in, not hacking in. And speaking of, identity, right, and logging in, well, it's fantastic to be using a VPN, right, or kind of secure authentication into a network. Those are internet-facing systems, right? And so adversaries are looking to actually target them. I mentioned supply chain attacks. They're actually trying to exploit them using 0 days or new exploits. We constantly see these coming up in the news, but they're trying to target those solutions that you've got on the edge, right? They're using to access your environments, VPNs to log into, and they're trying to actually penetrate those platforms themselves as a way in. So not just the users, right, but also targeting the technologies that organizations are leveraging now. And so, a great example of identity related threats is really business email compromise, right? So this is one of those most damaging, online and crimes where they're gaining access to legitimate business email. They might wait for weeks just watching how users communicate, and then be able to inject themselves into communications where they've learned how you talk. And now suddenly they're like, hey, I need you to go ahead and pay an invoice to a new bank account. They're going to personate the CEO. They're going to personate, kind of the executive assistant who's got access to that CEO's bank account. Just a couple examples. Or they're going to start collecting a bunch of information that you're passing back and forth from reports and internal correspondence over email, right? Or even to, O365 or cloud, collaboration environments. And they're going to steal that data. And they're going to possibly sell that on the dark web. So we see this continuing, trend over year of just financial losses occurring because of BEC. Now, obviously the complaints dipped there in 2020 and then continued, but that also corresponds with that shift that we saw in the pandemic, where suddenly a lot more people were at home. Identity became more prevalent of users accessing virtually. And so adversaries took hold of that, and they started to follow that pattern as well. Kind of continue, I talked about the evolution of ransomware itself, right? As defenders are getting better, that's the good news, we are, right, overall, threat actors are shifting, right? They're going to adapt. And so they're skipping that ransomware stage now, right? So they're going to actually log in, as we see in this diagram, kind of the journey and timeline here on the right. They're going to log in, get access. They're going to monitor and look at your environment, identify what that data is, and move around using the identity. And then they're going to steal that data first. And then they're going to possibly deploy ransomware, or they're going to extort you. And so it doesn't really matter, unfortunately, how great your endpoint security solution may be, if that's what you got, kind of your backup strategy is. They still got that data. It's still gone. So really need to be able to look at the user, right? The identity. How are users interacting with the data we have? Those legitimate solutions that they're leveraging, like file transfer solutions and remote management tools. Different things like that to evade detection, but that look like normal activity. So we now have to be kind of assuming breach, all of that zero trust kind of concept of what is being leveraged and what is the activity in my environment, and is this normal or not? And so we see where adversary groups, like we see the Hunters International, these are the same guys that took down Tata, right, over in India. They took down the U.S. Marshals Service in the U.S. They have shifted from ransomware to pure data extortion. It's a highly advanced group that has decided we're just going to move to this new model, far more effective, far faster. And, that data theft is, those demands are much more significant. We see $600,000 on average. That is not small, in addition to all the, other implications of a data breach that having to go through that. So, really, what do these threats mean? I've already kind of been talking about it, but, for business risk, it's really identifying the intersection of technology with how you all operate and what the cyber risk of technology and how it's used, really what that places on your business. So whether that's reputational risk and where an incident can destroy that brand, right? Or we've got a heavily reputational brand or trust really, aspect to what's important to your brand, or violation of compliance. Oops, we've lost significant information. We're going to face those financial and compliance penalties. Maybe it's about legal risk, right? We're seeing more and more how there are law firms out there now specializing in class action lawsuits against organizations that have suffered a data breach, right? And that can be kind of damning too, but also really that operational risk, halting business operations, system disruptions. People can't access information. They can't ship or move things. They can't make widgets. And what does that mean, right? How long can you go with being down? How long can you go before maybe, oops, we violated our contract agreement on delivery timelines and now we're paying penalties? And so that really ties in that financial risk I was mentioning, but also strategically, right? These can stop or stall initiatives. It can derail business strategies. Maybe it's about losing an actual property that you've created that creates that competitive advantage, and now it's out there on the market. And so being aware of, again, how technology intersects with your organization and how you do business is incredibly critical. So looking at more of the financials, some more kind of numbers, as I said, large focus of attacks on SMB, where the amount of money spent by SMBs to recover from an incident was obviously at the low end of $826, upwards of $1 million on the higher end. That's a lot, right? And only 14% of SMBs have some sort of, cybersecurity capability, whether that's, kind of more broader capabilities, response, kind of continuous monitoring. Maybe you have an MDR service, managed detection response, or a SOC service that's constantly watching your environment. But also 75% of SMBs said they were unable to operate if they were hit by ransomware. They just wouldn't know what to do, where to go. They'd be at a complete halt. And so 55% of those attacks are hitting businesses with fewer than 100 employees. All right. And then what's crazy is SMBs, right? Think about the way they're getting these credentials, it's access. 1 in every 323 phishing emails, and 350% more likely to be targeted with social engineering attacks. I mentioned, really, you're not too small to be targeted, right? And adversaries know this, and they're going to go after, right? Unfortunately, the weaker points where they may not have the budgets of those big Fortune 500s. And so we look at the average cost of dealing with a breach, right? Kind of covered some of it, but let's look at kind of the different components. If you have a breach, what do you got to be doing, right? What's that ramifications? So we have kind of the average cost that we see as well as the high end, depending on what you do. Investigation recovery of just forensics can be almost $80,000 on average, increasing up to $4 million. That means that you can't even access systems. You're at a full ground halt until they get through all of that, right? And then fines can be significant. The cost of reputation in terms of, lost clients, maybe you kind of, step backwards, but also missed opportunities, right? I mentioned that, kind of competitive, edge of intellectual property or a new initiative that is suddenly ground to a halt because you had to divert funds to something else, right, to respond to the breach, as well as just other costs. So this is really looking at the whole picture of what is it that orgs are up against, right? And what is the financial or business risk implications of a cyber incident on your organization? And is this too much to stomach? So that's something, again, as I said, only you can answer. But it's just really kind of the trend we see of breaches and then the impact downstream of those. So I've been kind of gloom and doom a little bit, right? But it's really about ripping that Band-Aid off and being, kind of aware of what's out there. But there is a path forward, right? So we can shift now, being a little more positive. So, what are some of the security solutions and strategies to manage this risk? Well, if we look at a lot of organizations like, okay, I need this tool and that tool, and I need this stuff, that's fantastic, right? But it's also really important to, I think, take a step back and think more about the business and what that's worth to you, as I was saying, and what is that strategy that you need? How am I best protecting the lines of business that I have, right? The revenue generation, the mission we have, the data we've got, and how am I aligning, when many orgs are looking at the right-hand side of this diagram, whether it's compliance, meeting cyber insurance requirements, but we unfortunately see that cyber insurance, and regulatory is unfortunately still a couple years behind the capabilities of adversaries. So how do we meet compliance or regulatory requirements that we may be legally held to, but also how do we, be able to, secure ourselves against the threats of today and tomorrow? And so that's really that strategy of how do we kind of adapt all the different ways that we're using technology, how we're identifying threats, how we hardening our systems, how we continuously monitoring and responding, can we recover from an incident? Really that journey of aligning to a strategy and kind of working through that is really where, organizations, I would encourage everyone to be looking at or thinking about, what is my strategy? Do I have one? And so really there are a couple, key recommendations that I would have. Reduce your attack surface. Be aware of all the different devices you've got and avenues in, even if that's doing an inventory, updating that inventory, being aware of what's internet exposed, what are the ways into my organization? Another way to think about it is, if you're reachable, you're breachable, right? How much am I exposing to bad actors there? And really maintaining full visibility. I talked about moving beyond endpoint into identity, right? Network, cloud environments, different components there, supply chains, other service providers. You need to be able to look at what are all the intersection of those different sources and how is that interacting in my environment. And then really understanding yourself. Focus on protecting your crown jewels. We can try and boil the ocean do everything at once, that's tough, right? You got to have the resources to go through that. Focus on what makes your business tick. What is the critical information that if I lost it, it'd be really damning? And then how am I protecting that and responding rapidly? And really aligning to a structured framework, whether it's CIS controls, NIST, et cetera, getting more of that strategy so that you can go ahead and start to, kind of align, get more of a structure in that path and journey forward. That's going to really help reinforce a lot of those. So, kind of coming open, I wanted to open it up to, come to close here, open it up to any Q&A that folks may, kind of have top of mind as I walk through this or anything of that nature.
Thanks, Andrew. Fast and furious. I love it. Hitting everybody with lots of information. If anyone has any questions, you can either drop them into the chat and or put your hand up or jump on. This is an informal group. You're welcome to do so. While people are thinking, with this big increase on focus on SMB, Andrew, what have you seen the rise of AI and automation, and has that influenced some of this? What's your take on what's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. AI and automation. I mean, many orgs, maybe some of you on the line, we're all looking at AI as process, enhancements and how we do more faster with less. And so there's a lot of value there. Adversaries are also looking at it of how do I get more information more rapidly of who I can target, how I can get more targeted on, kind of phishing a certain person. Also, how am I able to wage attacks faster? But also, how am I going to use, let's say, like coding techniques, right, with AI to generate new strains of malware, be able to kind of generate things. So AI is amplifying that volume and speed and capabilities of many adversaries. And so that's where I would really be kind of conscious of. It's impacting that volume. AI also, I mentioned insider risk. How are your employees using AI? How are they putting certain information up? Do you even know what people are doing, where they're going? And that's a critical thing too, right? Kind of proper use of AI with your organizations and how is that being leveraged? And maybe we need to kind of hold some of that back or monitor that until we can get a proper AI, kind of framework of how we're going to use that internally.
Awesome, thanks. Good insight. Because of the audience and the focus on this webinar is in the SMB space, how do you, our SMB clients, they don't have an unlimited budget, right? Everybody is tight. And even given the current economic climate where everyone's even a little tighter, a little more cautious, but how would an SMB business prioritize their cyber investments based on some of the new threats you shared with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start with two things, right? I mentioned observability. The key there is, kind of a solution like a SIM, security information event management solution, that's going to be able to digest everything going on across the environment, put all that data in, and understand what is and is not normal. That's going to give you that awareness of what is going on in the environment. Are people accessing AI? Do I see data leaving the front door? Why do I have this new service running? Why are these users accessing systems they just have no business doing? I think also, kind of more identity-focused solutions, right? I mentioned a VPN, but this is where we see that evolution of SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, really, but being more kind of walling off users to how are you, accessing my environment, right? Your environment. How are we interfacing and ensuring only these people are getting to O365 or certain devices? And that's really where we see, VPNs are great at monitoring and securing that perimeter from an authentication standpoint, but there's very little controls once they get in. So it's really about looking at the identity and controlling that, as well as being able to, kind of gain observability across the environment. I think those are two really key areas that will help SMBs identify what the state of things is going on, as we'll start to be able to wall off. That's why I'm saying those crown jewels, kind of doing that self-introspection of what is my critical data? Where is it sitting? Kind of where is that? And maybe focus on those. Just monitor that to start with. Who is interacting there? Where is that going? What's the activity? And then we can start building outwards. But those would be strategies and techniques I would say to, kind of really bite size, but where they will move the needle considerably is that observability, kind of really tightening some of those controls on users that don't need access, or how you're, ensuring that, you're able to manage those stolen credentials and those trends and that can really kind of handle a lot of these attack sequences before they actually start.
Awesome, Andrew. Thank you for that. Listen, I've got one question. We'll be able to provide the presentation slides. Yes, Sarah will be. We'll have the recording as well as the slides to those who registered. We are at time, just a little beyond that, Andrew. Thank you so much for taking some of your valuable time and spending it with us today and sharing some great insights on what's happening in the ever-growing cyber security space. So thank you so much. Everybody who has joined us, thank you. Really appreciate your time today. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Brad.